For those who lived through it, the console wars of the 1990s were an epic time to be alive. The unforgettable battle between Sega and Nintendo, and the rise of the Sony PlayStation are now considered the stuff of legends. But did you know that in this golden decade, Capcom would also release their own console? That's right, this king of arcade fighters, and the people who brought us the Mega Man series, would throw their hat into the ring, releasing a video game platform that could be taken home. Which may very well raise the questions, what happened to this system and why is it considered so obscure now? So with all of that said, hello ladies and gentlemen, Big Daddy Top Hat here. This is the story of the Capcom CPS Changer, the failed-forgotten Capcom console from 1994. Yeah! Capcom, the same company that arguably revitalised arcades with Street Fighter 2, who had also successfully developed a strong reputation as one of the greatest third-party developers and publishers for both Sega and Nintendo home consoles respectively. Given these accolades, it almost seems implausible that such a well-known entity would manage to release a home system to call their own, yet have it slip seemingly completely under the radar. So, what on earth went on here? Well, to fully understand today's story, our tale's origins can be traced back to 1979, to the near dawn of arcade gaming. In this Jurassic era of video games, an ambitious individual named Kenzo Tsuchimoto would make history by founding a little company known as IRM. During his reign, Tsuchimoto would concurrently serve as the president of another company called IREM, who were responsible for many arcade smash hits, notably the later R-Type series. In 1983, Tsuchimoto chose to leave his role at IREM and instead focus solely on his own business endeavours with IRM, resulting in a rebranding of the company to Capcom Company Limited. The famous Capcom brand name would be concocted as a clip compound of capsule computers, a synonym that was used to describe arcade machines at the time. In this brave new era, by 1984 Capcom published their first arcade game, a vertically scrolling shooter known as Vulgus. Quickly building a reputation for high quality games, Capcom established itself as one of the key developers for the Nintendo Famicom, releasing popular series like Mega Man and DuckTales games. In places where the NES was popular, such as the US, most gamers would come to associate the Capcom brand with quality. With the company's growth and the NES's success stateside to complement this and expand their operations, Capcom established a USA division responsible for growing the brand's presence into video gaming specifically for home computer formats, albeit mainly outsourcing development work to other companies. As profitable as all of this was for the company, it would not be until 1991 that they would truly strike gold. Any arcade historian would be able to tell you that that was the year that included the pivotal moment in which Street Fighter 2 was released in arcades. This revolutionary game of course not only set the blueprint for all future fighting games but also breathed life back into the then flailing arcade market itself. Street Fighter 2 would quickly morph into a cultural phenomenon, even spawning a Hollywood movie. A Hollywood movie that I must add features a cheeky appearance from Kenzo Tsuchimoto himself. There's a fun Easter egg for you. History shows us that the game's success extended beyond arcades and cinemas, impacting the home console market. Street Fighter 2 would famously, and sometimes infamously, be ported to just about every home format under the sun, with the Super Nintendo receiving the first notable port. To say that this Super Nintendo release was important would be an understatement, as Street Fighter 2 on the hardware would be a strong enough reason for many consumers to choose to pick up a 16-bit Nintendo console in the first place. Releasing Street Fighter 2 first on the system made sense, particularly when we account for Capcom's success on 8-bit Nintendo systems. In some regions, such as here, in the UK for example, even though Street Fighter is not a Nintendo license, Street Fighter 2 would still function as the Super Nintendo's packing game. The title was simply that commercially significant. While for some it may sound odd to not just pack the Super Nintendo with, say, Mario for example, this would not be the first time that a Nintendo console had been packed with a non-Nintendo developed game in the country. In fact, the NES never managed to achieve even an ounce of popularity in the region until it was packed with Teenage Mutant Hero Turtles, a decision that apparently Nintendo of Japan resisted, but Mike Hayes of Serif Games, who was in charge of UK marketing, insisted upon. Going with what was popular once more, Street Fighter 2 fit the bill. After all, it was being played in pubs and fish and chip shops across the land. Who wouldn't want an opportunity to take this gem home? So with so much success under their belt, and so many fingers in so many delicious pies, you may now be asking yourself why Capcom would even need a console to call their own when their presence was seemingly already everywhere. Well, it comes down to this. Capcom were always looking to continuously innovate and look for exciting new ways to expand their market. And while they were doing a lot in the world of video games already, one of their main rival competitors in the world of gaming was doing something they wasn't doing. I am, of course, talking about fellow arcade juggernauts SNK, the very company who Capcom were always attempting to one-up, particularly when it came to anything to do with fighting games. As while Capcom were building on their Street Fighter franchise, SNK would be busy simultaneously establishing the likes of Fatal Fury, Art of Fighting, Samurai Shodown, and King of Fighters. This was made all the more interesting by the fact that this movement was spearheaded by SNK employee Takeshi Nishiyama, the same man who had created the original Street Fighter game for Capcom back in 1987. The rivalry between these brands was close, intertwined, and personal. SNK titles would manage to successfully carve out their own niche as popular, competent, competitive fighting games, and as iconic as Street Fighter 2 was, these SNK fighters offered something to arcade vendors that Capcom classics didn't. This advantage lay with the SNK arcade cabinets themselves, which offered a huge economic benefit. These Neo Geo arcade machines, known as the MVS, not only offered interchangeable cartridge technology, making it possible for them to house multiple cartridges simultaneously, but there was also an accompanying home console which the same excellent games could be enjoyed on. The Neo Geo AES brought the arcade experience home quite literally, something that no other console was capable of over the period. Sure, the likes of the Mega Drive and Super Nintendo featured scaled down ports that were kind of like the arcade games, but the Neo Geo AES allowed gamers to play exactly the same versions of the titles which could be experienced in the arcades. Sadly, such a luxury would come at a huge cost that many consumers could not afford, but at least the option was there, even if the majority of gamers who played the AES at home were only able to enjoy the device via renting games as opposed to actually buying them. Bearing witness to this amazing product, Capcom would make the bold decision to opt to release a direct answer to this console, thus meaning they too would produce a high-end gaming platform that would finally allow gamers to have a true Capcom arcade experience in the living room. Through this, a device known as the Capcom CPS Changer was born, which like the AES meant that literal arcade games could be played on 90s gamers' TVs. Now, having a vague idea of what this thing was for, let's discuss what it was capable of. Analysing this strange forgotten system, it quickly becomes clear that it is heavily based on technology that could be found using Capcom CP System 1 arcade boards, the same boards that ran the likes of the iconic Street Fighter 2 and many other arcade classics of the era. As awesome as it would of course be to own one of these contraptions as of today, sadly, if you are looking for one of these machines now, you are likely to have an extremely tricky time. The problem comes from the fact that even back in 1994, these were released in extremely limited numbers and sold solely in their homeland of Japan, for reasons we shall break down in a moment. While comparisons are easy to make between Capcom and SNK's console creation for obvious reasons, how these platforms brought the arcade experience home was quite different. Some might actually consider this contraption to be a console with its own library of physically compatible games. However, when we bring more semantics into play, and the different way in which it functions, some consider this technology to be something different and more in line with a device known as a supergun, an interface that allows JAMMA-compatible arcade games to be played on a TV rather than simply with an arcade cabinet. Like the supergun, the CPS Changer allows software to be hooked up with an interface module, which can be connected to a controller and monitor. To further explain the difference between this process and with a traditional console, is that a regular console like say a Super Nintendo has a main processor CPU which is located within the base of the console itself, and the software is located within interchangeable cartridges with only a few exceptions to this rule, such as the Super FX chip which can be found in Star Fox cartridges. But the CPS Changer differs from tradition as every software module contains its very own CPU, audio amplifier ROMs, and everything else required to make a game run, all self-contained within each physical game. This meant, unlike a traditional console, the CPS Changer acts more like an adapter that allows you to connect each software module to a television and hook up controllers. In terms of this technology, it basically took games that were made for the Capcom System 1 arcade board and packaged them in a format that would allow them to run on a home-friendly commercial-grade system. As for the Capcom CPS Changer itself, it features a custom Capcom microprocessor that converts RGB visuals to S-video or composite, which were the standards in Japanese homes at the system's time of release. Interestingly, the system never technically had its own controller, and instead was compatible with Super Famicom controllers. I would imagine that this is because they needed to scale back production costs somewhere, and most of their target market would already have owned Super Famicom controllers anyway. Let's be honest, you would have needed to be a pretty die-hard gamer to want to fork out for one of these high-end products in the first place. While the CPS Changer does work with any Super Famicom controller, Capcom would over the period release their own Super Famicom controller. This was known as the Power Stick Fighter, a peripheral that was bespoke for playing arcade-like games at home, even if many gamers questioned the control scheme's overall quality. This niche offering would of course end up being pretty obscure pretty quickly, and not only was this only released in Japan in limited numbers, but it was also only available via mail order. To be fair, this was the same as the TurboGrafx in the UK, which makes sense as to why the UK TurboGrafx is so obscure too. The CPS Changer mail order could be found in Japanese gaming magazines, with the system being distributed by Capcom themselves. The original bundle included the system itself, if you want to call it that, the Power Stick we mentioned earlier, and Street Fighter 2 Hyper Fighting. If you wanted to procure this offering, the bundle would set gamers back the equivalent of $332 back then, and if consumers wanted to add more games to their library, it would cost them $167 each. To put this pricing into perspective, it meant that CPS Changer games would be pricier than games available on the emerging Sony PlayStation and Sega Saturn. Games that by that point were arguably more exciting and cutting edge than the aging Capcom System 1 board games anyway. Throughout the device's obscure existence, gamers would see the release of 11 different titles that could be run using the System Changer. Rather surprisingly though, as a final thank you to consumers who had chosen to invest in this niche offering, Capcom would publish a version of Street Fighter Alpha for the platform, a game that had previously been designed to run on Capcom's newer Capcom System 2 board. Which is amusing, as the device that was sold on being able to bring the true arcade experience home would feature a watered down, scaled back port that would almost bring the arcade experience home. Still though, if gamers wanted to get their hands on this obscurity, due to its bespoke nature, the title would be even pricier than the regular $167, and instead would set back players a whopping $292. Mental. Looking back at this rare piece of hardware, it is quite clear that the arrival of 32-bit consoles and the Capcom System 2 board, and then later the System 3, would result in the Capcom System Changer becoming dated technology very quickly. Still though, it is a remarkably interesting footnote in gaming history, and unbelievably interesting to learn that a perfect version of Street Fighter 2 could be played in the homes as early as 1994. Anyway, if you enjoyed this one, check out my recent uploads on these lost console add-ons. Yeah, cheerio.